Chivalry, or the chivalric code, is a code of conduct associated with the medieval institution of knighthood which developed between 1170 and 1220. The Code of Chivalry that developed in medieval Europe had its roots in earlier centuries. It arose in the Holy Roman Empire from the idealisation of the cavalryman, involving military bravery, individual training, and service to others, especially in Francia, among horse soldiers in Charlemagne's cavalry. The term chivalry derives from the Old French term chevalerie, which can be translated to horse soldiery. Gautier states that knighthood emerged from the Moors as well as the Teutonic forests and was nurtured into civilization and chivalry by the Catholic Church. Over time, its meaning in Europe has been refined to emphasize social and moral virtues more generally influenced by Arabic concept of chivalry, and the Code of Chivalry, as it stood by the late Middle Ages, was a moral system which combined a warrior ethos, knightly piety, and courtly manners, all conspiring to establish a notion of honor and nobility. Terminology and definitions. In origin, the term chivalry means horsemanship, formed in Old French, in the 11th century, from chevalier, horseman, knight, from medieval Latin cabal arius. The French word chevalier originally means a man of aristocratic standing, and probably of noble ancestry, who is capable, if called upon, of equipping himself with a war horse and the arms of heavy cavalryman, and who has been through certain rituals that make him what he is. In English, the term appears from 1292, note that cavalry is from the Italian form of the same word. The meaning of the term evolved over time because the word chevalier was used differently in the Middle Ages, from the original concrete military meaning status or fee associated with military follower owning a war horse or a group of mounted knights, to the ideal of the Christian warrior ethos propagated in the Romance genre, which was becoming popular during the 12th century, and the ideal of courtly love propagated in the contemporary mint and related genres. Thus, chivalry has hierarchical meanings, from simply a heavily armed horseman to a code of conduct. The ideas of chivalry originated in three medieval works: the anonymous poem Ordine de Chivalry, that tells the story of how Hugh II of Tiberias was captured and released upon his agreement to show Saladin, 1138 to 1193, the ritual of Christian knighthood, the Liber del Order de Cavalleria, written by Ramon Lull, 1232 to 1315, whose subject is knighthood, and the Livre de Chivalry of Gautier de Charny, 1300 to 1356, which examines the qualities of knighthood, emphasizing prowess. Based on the three treatises, initially chivalry was defined as a way of life in which three essential aspects fused together: the military, the nobility, the religion. The Code of Chivalry is thus a product of the late Middle Ages, evolving after the end of the Crusades partly from an idealization of the historical knights fighting in the Holy Land, partly from ideals of courtly love. Léon Gautier, in his La Chevalerie, published for the first time in 1883, bemoaned the invasion of Breton Romans, which replaced the pure military ethos of the Crusades with Arthurian fiction and courtly adventures. Gautier tries to give a popular summary of what he proposes was the ancient code of chivalry of the 11th and 12th centuries, derived from the military ethos of the Crusades, which would evolve into the late medieval notion of chivalry. Gautier's 10 commandments of chivalry are: thou shalt believe all that the Church teaches and thou shalt observe all its directions, believe the Church's teachings and observe all the Church's directions. Thou shalt defend the Church. Thou shalt respect all weaknesses, and shalt constitute thyself the defender of them. Thou shalt love the country in which thou wast born. Thou shalt not recoil before thine enemy. Thou shalt make war against the infidel without cessation and without mercy. Thou shalt perform scrupulously thy feudal duties, if they be not contrary to the laws of God. Thou shalt never lie, and shalt remain faithful to thy pledged word. Thou shalt be generous, and give largesse to everyone. Thou shalt be everywhere and always the champion of the right and the good against injustice and evil. Literary chivalry and historical reality. Fans of chivalry assume, and have assumed since the late medieval period, that there was a time in the past when chivalry was a living institution, when men acted chivalrically, when chivalry was alive and not dead, the imitation of which period would much improve the present. This is the mad mission of Don Quixote, protagonist of the most chivalric novel of all time and inspirer of the chivalry of Sir Walter Scott and of the U.S. South, to restore the age of chivalry, and thereby improve his country. It is a version of the myth of the Golden Age. With the birth of modern historical and literary research, scholars have found that however far back in time the age of chivalry is searched for, it is always further in the past, even back to the Roman Empire. From Jean-Charles Leonard de Sismondi, we must not confound chivalry with the feudal system. The feudal system may be called the real life of the period of which we are treating, possessing its advantages and inconveniences, its virtues and its vices. Chivalry, on the contrary, is the ideal world, such as it existed in the imaginations of the Romance writers. Its essential character is devotion to woman and to honor. Sismondi alludes to the fictitious Arthurian romances about the imaginary court of King Arthur, which were usually taken as factual presentations of a historical age of chivalry. He continues, the more closely we look into history, the more clearly shall we perceive that the system of chivalry is an invention almost entirely poetical. It is impossible to distinguish the countries in which it is said to have prevailed. It is always represented as distant from us both in time and place, and whilst the contemporary historians give us a clear, detailed, and complete account of the vices of the court and the great, of the ferocity or corruption of the nobles, and of the servility of the people, we are astonished to find the poets, after a long lapse of time, adorning the very same ages with the most splendid fictions of grace, virtue, and loyalty. The Romance writers of the 12th century place the age of chivalry in the time of Charlemagne. The period when these writers existed, is the time pointed out by Francis I. At the present day, we imagine we can still see chivalry flourishing in the persons of Du Guesclin and Bayard, under Charles V and Francis I. But when we come to examine either the one period or the other, although we find in each some heroic spirits, we are forced to confess that it is necessary to antedate the age of chivalry, at least 3 or 4 centuries before any period of authentic history. History. Further information. Knight and Orders of Knighthood. According to Crouch, many early writers on medieval chivalry cannot be trusted as historians, because they sometimes have polemical purpose which colors their prose. As for M. Henry Digby and Leon Gautier, chivalry was a means to transform their corrupt and secular worlds. Gautier also emphasized that chivalry originated from the Teutonic forests and brought up into civilization by the Catholic Church. Charles Mills used chivalry to demonstrate that the Regency gentleman was the ethical heir of a great moral estate, and to provide an inventory of its treasure. Mills also stated that chivalry was a social, not a military phenomenon, with its key features, generosity, fidelity, liberality, and courtesy. Europe before 1170, the noble habitus, according to Crouch. Prior to codified chivalry there was the uncodified code of noble conduct that focused on the riudomi. This uncodified code, referred to as the noble habitus, is a term for the environment of behavioral and material expectations generated by all societies and classes. As a modern idea, it was pioneered by the French philosopher, sociologists Pierre Bourdieu and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, even though a precedent exists for the concept as far back as the works of Aristotle. Crouch argues that the habitus on which the superstructure of chivalry was built and the Reutomy was a part, had existed long before 1100, while the codified medieval noble conduct only began between 1170 and 1220. The pre-chivalric noble habitus as discovered by Mills and Gautier are as follows: loyalty, it is a practical utility in a warrior nobility. Richard Cooper associates loyalty with prowess. The importance of reputation for loyalty in noble conduct is demonstrated in William Marshall biography. Forbearance, knights' self-control towards other warriors and at the courts of their lords was a part of the early noble habitus as shown in the Conventum of Hugh de Lusignan in the 1020s. The nobility of mercy and forbearance was well established by the second half of the 12th century, long before there was any code of chivalry. Hardihood, the quality of hardy aligns itself with forbearance and loyalty in being one of the military virtues of the Reutomy. According to Philip de Navarra, a mature nobleman should have acquired hardiness as part of his moral virtues. Geoffrey de Charny also stressed on the masculine respectability of hardiness in the light of religious feeling of the contemptus mundi. Largesse or liberality, generosity was part of a noble quantity. According to Alan of Lille, largesse was not just a simple matter of giving away what he had, but largesse in a man caused him to set no store on greed or gifts, and to have nothing but contempt for bribes. The Davidic ethic, it is the strongest qualities of Reutomy derived by clerics from biblical tradition. Originally it was a set of expectations of good rulership articulated by the Frankish Church, which involved the rightful authority based on protection for the weak and helpless, in particular the Church, respect for widows and orphans, and opposition to the cruel and unjust. The core of Davidic ethic is benevolence of the strong toward the weak. Honor. Honor was what was achieved by living up to the ideal of the Reutomy and pursuing the qualities and behavior listed above. The loss of honor is an humiliation to a man's standing and is worse than death. Bertrand de Born said, "For myself I prefer to hold a little piece of land in honor, than to hold a great empire with dishonor." The Code of Chivalry, as it was known at late medieval age, developed between 1170 and 1220. Origins in military ethos. Chivalry was developed in the north of France around the mid-12th century but adopted its structure in a European context. New social status, new military techniques, and new literary topics were adhered to a new character known as the knight and his ethos called chivalry. The chivalric ideals are based on those of the early medieval warrior class, and martial exercise and military virtue remains an integral part of chivalry until the end of the medieval period, as the reality on the battlefield changed with the development of early modern warfare increasingly restricted to the tournament ground and dueling culture. The joust remained the primary example of knightly display of martial skill throughout the Renaissance. The last Elizabethan accession day tilt was held in 1602. The martial skills of the knight carried over to the practice of the hunt, and hunting expertise became an important aspect of courtly life in the later medieval period. See terms of venery. Related to chivalry was the practice of heraldry and its elaborate rules of displaying coats of arms as it emerged in the High Middle Ages.